So a very warm welcome this evening to our second session on transition between Key Stage 2 and Key Stage 3. Tonight it's a Zoom meeting rather than a webinar because we want to make sure that everyone has plenty of opportunity to talk in breakout rooms later to kind of compare pedagogy, practice and policy, and hopefully have a really rich discussion about the current issues we're all facing post-lockdown in helping to prepare children for the really smooth transition between years 5, 6, 7 and 8. We hope it will be really enlightening and helpful to everybody going forward, and we're absolutely thrilled again to welcome back Alison Hopper from MEI as our guest speaker tonight, who'll be talking a bit about ratio later. And you'll see on the screen we've got some questions, ratio questions from Key Stage 2 and Key Stage 3. You have to just decide really how you might approach any of the questions on the screen if you were trying to teach them in upper Key Stage 2 and lower Key Stage 3, and also tell us as well which one you think might be the easiest one and which is the hardest. And Sarah, how do they respond to that tonight?
So I think we're going to ask people just to put that into the chat. Is that right, Ruth?
Brilliant. Right. Just into the chat then. It's brilliant.
So, yeah, so if you can put down the one that you found the hardest first and then the easiest. Don't be shy.
So first person in says number 4 I think is the hardest question. Number 5 is the easiest. What do you think? Do you agree or disagree? Now's your time to say.
I love that word in number 4, the most orangey squash. It's a really nice way of putting it.
Number 5 has fewer words, but quite a lot going on, just equivalent ratios there. So I'm interested in what you all think. Someone else is voting for 5 as the easiest. What do you think?
Now, I did wonder if number 3 was harder. You don't think number 3, anybody?
I'm hoping nobody would see me reach for a pen and pencil for number 3, actually. I might turn my camera off and have a look at that one.
Oh, interesting. Number 1, the easiest. It is quite a shorter question. So in a minute we'll share which key stage these are all from and see whether you're surprised by any or not.
So Louise is just saying the language in 4 is hardest to understand. Great to have your feedback as you grapple with all of these.
Right, we happy? Shall I start going through them?
I think so. That sounds great.
Yep. Oh, another one. 8 easiest as the numbers jumped out. So maybe the numbers are sort of easy to spot in that question, perhaps. And 3 hardest, 1 easiest. So I think possibly some of these you might be surprised by and perhaps some not. So I'm just going to go through which key stage each of them are from. So the majority of these questions have come from the NCTM assessment materials for year 6 and for key stage 3. So looking year 7, 8, 9. So going through them, these 2 are year 6 questions. So in theory, these are the easiest in demand in terms of the age at which these would be given. And this one is also a year 6 question, but this was the mastery with greater depth. So a question similar, but perhaps asking for a little bit more understanding. The next ones are our key stage 3 questions. So those ones, the orangey squash and the fill in the boxes. Those are all 3, year 7, 8, 9, so key stage 3 questions. And again, this one here, question 9 was a mastery with greater depth question. So I wonder, that leaves us with two questions, obviously, that we haven't looked at, which is these two. And actually, these are both Key Stage 4 questions, and these are GCSE questions, which possibly might surprise you, particularly question 1, but that's taken from a foundation paper. So for some students, that is kind of the level of ratio that they are able to reach. And at GCSE, obviously, question 3, a slightly more demanding question. But looking at all of them, kind of the sort of similar skills that are running through, and obviously at GCSE they can develop it, would then perhaps be combined with algebra and look in more detail at certain aspects of it. But the skills that are kind of there going all the way through from primary into secondary really there are lots of similarities, and therefore lots to be looked at across the two.
Thank you. Alison, any thoughts and feedback on that task?
I know it's a really interesting one, and it's one we've looked at with the 5 to 8 continuity work group. So we've looked at this sort of work, and I think I'm not going to say too much because I don't want to spoil what Sarah's going to say next and what I'm going to talk about. But if people like that word, the orangey bit, I'm just putting into the chat an activity from Don Stewart called Orangia, which is a lovely ratio activity looking at how do you know if a certain mix of squash is orangier than the other. So really nice one if you're into making orange squash.
That's great, and of course we'll add that to our Padlet. And if you weren't here for the last session, just to say, make sure you get the link to our Padlet tonight, because that's full of an amazing array of resources to support you in your roles and your tasks. So next up, I believe we're going to have a word cloud task from Sarah. Is that right, Sarah?
Yes, in just a moment. So if you haven't done so already, can we just ask you to change your name so that if you just hover over it and right click and press rename, then just change it so it says your name and then P or S for primary or secondary, or B for both, and your nearest town or city to your school. On here, I've got the links to the Padlet, which Jenny's just spoken about, and also a link to another document that we're going to be using today, which is also on the Padlet. I'll put those into the chat for you in just a moment. But we are going to go on to our word cloud first. So if actually somebody else could type into the chat that code for me, that would be really useful, Jenny. So what issues are you here to try and resolve today, whether you were at the first session or not? What are your hot potatoes in terms of Key Stage 2 to 3 transition? What do you need to know? What do you want to find out? So if you go to the word cloud, you can use the same device that you're working on now, or you can just do it on a phone and enter that code. Just go to www.menti.com, enter the code 98 21 23 84, and you should be able to put in as many words as you like.
Sarah, Ruth typed in. Is that the correct one you wanted in there?
Is it coming up as something else then, Ruth? Is it not working? Let me check.
Yeah, I took it from the PowerPoint, but it might be an older version.
Let me just stop sharing. Check. I did wonder why it came up with a different code today. No, it's got that on mine. It's not working then. Okay, let me just check why that is. Bear with me, everybody. That looks okay. Okay, let me just try putting this one into the chat and see if this works.
Thanks, Sarah.
I hope this one works. Can you try that one quickly, Ruth, and see if that works?
Yeah. Yeah, all good.
Okay, great. So in the chat, you will find the code.
Yeah, so you just click on that link and you just get some boxes you can write in whatever you like.
You try and keep your statements fairly short. That works better for a word cloud.
So we're looking for your hot potatoes tonight. What are the issues?
I'm just going to share my screen so everybody can see what's coming up. If you've just joined us, there's a code in the chats, and if you go to www.menti.com and you can enter some words in to try and tell us what you're here for today, what you want, what issues do you want to resolve, what are your hot potatoes in terms of Key Stage 2 to 3 transition. So I can see that word consistency is coming out quite a lot in there. Language, continuity, progress. Yeah, times tables has come up a few times. Confidence. Challenge, ready to progress.
Overlap's really interesting, isn't it? As you can see from that previous sort of pastry task we had at the beginning of looking at those ratio questions, overlap is clearly huge. It's about, again, that progression, isn't it, continuity within that. That's absolutely crucial. That's where we can really help each other tonight by having this really rich discussion later on about content.
Interesting one there as well about the expectations from Key Stage, well, it says from Key Stage 3, but into Key Stage 3, and avoid repetition, Key Stage 2 to 3. Gaps in coverage, so the word gaps has come up a few times, and overlap, they're all kind of grouped together.
I think, you know, more than ever this year, that's going to be really important. What's been covered, what might have been missed out, or maybe not covered in quite as much depth this year, given everything that we've been through, what might need kind of covering from a slightly earlier point going through next year.
Absolutely. Just give you another 30 seconds, see if you want to put any more words into there. Okay, so that will be available for you to see on the Padlet later on. We're just going to move on, so let me just make sure I'm sharing the right screen. So hopefully we will address most of the things that have come up there in today's session, and hopefully this will be a kind of an idea to kind of kickstart you if you're not already having those transition discussions with your school that you transition to or from. Okay, I've got a Freya model here, which I've adjusted slightly. If you haven't seen Freya models before, do have a look. I'll put a link on the Padlet later to a couple of websites that could be useful to you. So I'm not going to read through the whole thing because it's here for you, but I'm going to draw your attention to the top right where it says Craig Barton's 5 stages of deliberate practice, and the bottom left where it says Emma McRae's. And really, I like this because this is Craig Barton and Emma McRae, 2 people that have written fantastic books about teaching maths and know a lot about mathematical pedagogy. And what I like really here is we've got, you know, a kind of competition, Craig versus Emma, which I think they'd be quite over the moon that we're having this competition here. So have a look there at what they think deliberate practice is and their kind of stages of deliberate practice, and come up with which one is your favourite. So have a little look and then put into the chat whether you like Craig's or Emma's. So I'll give you 1 minute to do this. Can anybody read what's coming into the chat for me? I can't see it at the moment.
Sure.
Just waiting for responses at the minute.
Okay.
Not reading.
Have you got a favourite, Ruth?
I mean, I quite like a numbering of something to sort of work through, but I feel like Emma's might be a little bit, maybe less steps to it, I suppose.
Yeah, I think I like Emma's because it's more succinct.
Matt's contributed and he says that for me it's Emma's because the carefully crafted phrase has swung it for him. And yet someone else has said they really like Craig's retrieval practice, of course, but Emma's immediate feedback.
Yeah.
Emma's can be viewed as more accommodating and nurturing, very kind of encouraging language and the way she's written that. And of course, Craig makes the point about repetition over time is absolutely crucial to withhold knowledge. Other comment there, Emma's feedback immediately obviously works for them. Thank you, Joe. Some of us again concur with that. And adjusting targets and misconceptions quickly, absolutely key, of course, isn't it?
So it's really useful to look at both of theirs actually and take, you know, bits from either of them, because we wouldn't want to forget about the final performance or retrieval later. But I suppose it depends what you're looking at. And I like looking at Emma's because it keeps it simple. But I do, you know, I still agree that we need to look at retrieval practice. So we're going to hone in on a particular part of that, and we're going to look at isolating the skill, which both Emma and Craig agree on as being an essential characteristic of deliberate practice. So if you haven't come across isolating the skill before, I've got an example here for you, and it's a really simple example, but you could make it more complicated. So the number 5 is in a part-part whole diagram, and the question is just to draw complete as many as you can. And when we talk about isolating the skill, what we want to do is we want to think about how many skills are needed to solve this problem and what are all of those skills. And we might want to think, you know, if a teacher who say taught year 2 was teaching this, how would they break that problem down so it's got as many steps, tiny steps, that there are no gaps between those steps so that every child can achieve it. And you'll notice that there's a big warning triangle in the bottom right hand corner, and that's because I really want everybody to be aware of the curse of knowledge. So once you are good at a subject, and obviously as teachers we've all had to get through, you know, a certain kind of jump over a certain bar to be able to train as teachers, it's very easy for us to forget what it's like to struggle in mathematics. So we've got to be really careful to not presume that children know anything in particular. And so it's really good doing this exercise in collaboration, and actually you get a much better list. So in a minute we're going to have a go at writing a list and just putting it into the chat. Is Debs there? Did you want to add anything, Debs, to this discussion?
Yes, I just was talking when we were planning this about some techniques that I've heard of for doing this, which is whatever list you write initially to isolate the skill, leave a line between each skill and try and fill those gaps in between each skill so that you are always breaking it down into smaller and smaller parts. That doesn't necessarily mean you're going to go back over and test on each skill or assess each skill. And some of them you will find that your children will know, but you want to get it down to as smaller parts as possible to begin with. So write a list, then try and fit everything in between all of the things that the stages that you've already got.
So I've got a list here. This is an example just for that one there. But you might find that there are some things that you think I've missed out that could go into gaps in between those. So it's not exhaustive. Your list might be slightly different to mine, but that was my list. And then what I'd like you to do is to think of this example. So for every 3 meters of fence, I need 4 fence panels. The fence will be 15 meters long. How many fence panels will I need? So I want you to think about all the tiny little skills that are needed to solve this and what they are. And when you've come up with those, can you try and put them as briefly as you can into the chat?
First bit of feedback is division.
And again, you might want to think, you know, although this sort of ratio problem doesn't occur in Key Stage 2 really until year 6. You might want to think, if you were teaching this to a year 2 class, you know, to children as young as kind of 7, how might you go about teaching it to them? That's quite a useful way to think of it as well. What might they need to know? How could you teach them to do this? How might you do it differently with the 7-year-olds to how you might do it with 13-year-olds or 11-year-olds? What concrete apparatus might you use? All of those things can be considered really when you're trying to isolate the skill.
Getting quite a bit in the chat now, Sarah. Do you want to hear some of the chat yet?
Yeah, fantastic.
Okay, we've got scaling, ratio, division, multiplication, knowledge of meters and measures, ratio, times table facts, problem solving, modelling maybe with multi-link cubes, visualization diagrams, groups of 4.
Great.
Counting.
Yeah, that's fantastic. So we've got all of those different skills, and then what we would need to do is to try and put them into an ordered list so that we can break it down into tiny steps and think, what do we need to do first? And I'll make a space available on the Padlet so that perhaps we can start to kind of construct a list of how we would isolate the skill for that program on there. What I'm going to do now is I'm going to hand over to Alison, who's going to take you through the next section.
Thanks, Sarah.
Yeah, thanks, Sarah. Sorry, I was getting too caught up in doing the problem and thinking about the skills and not getting myself set up, so I apologise. Yeah, I'm going to talk about ratio and about problems very similar to the one that that Sarah's just shared. If it's going to be very quick, and I say straight away, I've got far too many slides. But if you're interested in hearing it at a slightly slower pace, then this is part of one of the recorded webinars on the MEI website about transition and looking at ratio across the Key Stage 2-3 transition. So I will garble through the next few slides, and I won't dwell on them as much as they deserve, but please do go and check it out. And I'm fairly sure that Sarah's got the link to those webinars on the Padlet as well, so you can see there. But it's really interesting because I apologise if I was frowning and thinking about it, because words are coming up and thinking, well, I've done it down here. Have I used that? Well, I'm not sure. I'll have to have a think about it. How have I done it? Why have I done it differently? I'm not sure I did any division. And so I was thinking, well, what did I do that meant I didn't do division? So it's really interesting, and so many things coming up from your word cloud, really fascinating. And I'd like this to be about four hours rather than 1 hour. But just to say, I'm more than happy to talk about transition. There was a little bit about the overlap, and so everybody's now going to go, where's this come from? She didn't have this in her original one. But thinking about the overlap between Key Stage 2 and 3 curriculum. When I highlighted this is my personal take on where the overlap is, and other people may disagree, but I think this is the Key Stage 3 curriculum, or part of it, obviously, which includes ratio. And these, I think, are the green bits, which, if we talk about them in the same way, our pupils moving from year 6 to 7 will be familiar. They will have experienced this before. But I think one of the key things is if we talk about it and model it in the same way, because I'm building a picture, having experienced it a little bit myself in the work I do across Key Stage 2 and 3, that sometimes maths can be presented to us in a way that isn't familiar to us. And because we're all grown-ups, we all go, hang on a minute, I know about ratio, I understand ratio, what's going on? How do I make sense of this? Which is great. But when you're 11 years old and you're in a brand new school with brand new teachers and possibly not even a whole load of people around you that you know, and something is presented to you with unfamiliar language, unfamiliar representations, I can totally understand the feeling of going, I don't get this, I've not done this before. And so sometimes I think, I did one talk entitled, It's the Way We Tell Them. And sometimes it's incredibly important that we have that continuity in language and representation. So that's what this is all about. So there's quite a lot of overlap there. The bit that I think I put in bold is that they may or may not have used that ratio sign in primary school. Some will, some won't, but it's in the non-statutory bit of the curriculum, but there is overlap, and these are the bits that I picked out that I felt we've done a bit of it in primary school, but possibly not in these words. And so that's where opportunities like this to talk across the Key Stage 2-3 boundary and go, so you do things like, oh, but you talk about it like that. Oh, that's really interesting. Oh, that's how you're going to represent it. brilliant, and we can start to get that dialogue going. So yeah, it's really important to know, especially in the current climate, what has been covered and where the gaps are. But I think it's also incredibly important to understand what has been covered, but not just what, but how will these children be thinking about the maths that they're bringing with them. And I'm going to say it at this point, in case I run, because I will run out of time, just remember that these little ones that you think as they come into year 7, little ones, we in years, for us leaving, saying goodbye to them at the end of year 6, they're the great big members of our school, but to you they're the little ones coming in. And they will be new and shiny, and their uniforms will be too big, but they've got at least 7 years of mathematical development under their belts. You know, they've been learning maths since they started walking and counting stairs with their parents and things, and they've been learning maths in a more formal way at school since they were 4 years old. So I think they deserve to have that mathematical learning cherished. Okay, so one of the things that we've got at the moment that's really useful to help us is the primary guidance materials that came out last July. Not with COVID in mind, they were started before that, but they're actually really useful. And since that, the primary, there's more, I've forgotten the name of it now, but there's a new NCETM document that helps with prioritization materials, that's it, which will really help you to have those conversations, I think. So this is where ratio sits in the mathematics guidance, the primary mathematics guidance. So there it is, it's there, solve problems involving ratio relationships. And where I think it really comes from, and what came through in your comments, is that idea that numbers can be related multiplicatively. A lot of children are very confident with additive relationships, but not so confident with multiplicative relationships. So if you say, how do you turn 3 into 6? The go-to will be, well, you add 3. The less familiar way will be to say, well, you can double it. And that has an enormous impact on their thinking as they go on. And we know how much of the upper primary, but certainly the Key Stage 3 and then on into the GCSE curriculum, is absolutely underpinned by a really secure understanding of multiplicative relationships. So this is why ratio is one of those really important ones for starting to think about it. So those multiplicative relationships, really important. But then there's this bit about making this connections bit. And you'll have spotted perhaps on that title slide that we've done a lot of one-to-one correspondence, and we've shared things out, one for you, one for me, and we've shared things out in ones. And when we come to think about ratio, we're thinking about that one-to-many relationship, a many-to-one relationship. And then in a lot of those problems we had on that very first slide when you came in was that idea of a many-to-many relationship. And so I think that's one skill to isolate out. Are we really clear about when we're talking about a one-to-one relationship and those many-to-one, one-to-many, many-to-many relationships? And as a first bit, I'd want children to go, hang on, what's the same and what's different about this from what we've done before? Okay, so there it sits. So this is just a bit from the teaching guidance of thinking about those relationships. For every one cup of rice, you need 2 cups of water. For every 10 children on the trip, there must be 1 adult. For every 2 yellow beads, there are 3 green beads. So those different relationships. But this is the bit that really stood out for me and comes back to what Sarah was saying about isolating the skill, and links to what you were all saying about how many different ways you solved that fence panels problem in amongst yourselves. That underlying all of this is that pupils have the arithmetic skills to solve problems involving ratio. They've got the arithmetic there. What they need to have is that understanding about how those numbers relate to each other. And just in the variety in the chat shows how differently we all interpreted that problem. And that's what you're going to get with your, with your class of 30 in year 6. They'll bring different bits of maths that they're confident with to solve that problem. And what we need to be aware of is that there's going to be a range of ways of thinking about this as they come into secondary school and as they leave us in primary school. Okay, so this is one of the problems that we had on the slide at the beginning, and I'm just going to run through some of the representations that we'll be using in primary school, and I'm hoping that primary teachers sitting there will smile and nod and agree. So here we've got the problem. The word ratio isn't there, the colon isn't there, so we've got to understand that this is one of these many-to-many relationships. So we're sharing marbles out, but we're not sharing them equally, we're doing an unequal share. So for every 2 marbles, Sam gets, Tom gets 3. So we're not going 1 for you, 1 for me. we're going 2 for you, 3 for me, or 2 for Sam, 3 for Tom. So we're going to share the marbles out, 2 for Sam, 3 for Tom, 2 for Sam, 3 for Tom. How are we going to know when we've given out 45 marbles? So how can we represent this problem in a way that it's going to make sense to children? Well, marbles are a bit of a nightmare because they roll off the table. So I'm going to instead of using marbles, there we go, that's what you'd hear about in the presentation I'm going to go on. I'm going to substitute marbles for counters because they stay in a pile on the table. So let's just run through a couple of animations of what we might do in class. So we're going to get our 45 marbles, 45 counters, and let's share them out and see what happens. So we can count up the piles, we can keep a count of the total of the marbles. Excellent. I always want to ask for a round of applause at the end of that, which please don't give it, but it took hours. And can I just give a word of advice? I know we're not doing it on trains, but don't try to do things like this on a train, because just as you get into the crucial bit, you go over a bump and your counter goes shooting off across the screen. Anyway, so we could build up piles of counters. So we've actually got 45 things there. So we're in the proper concrete inactive stage of representation here. We've really got the things, and we can see, and it's blatantly obvious how many more marbles Tom gets than Sam, isn't it? Because it's that pile there. And he gets 9 more because we did it 9 times, and we can count the counters. So we can solve it in a purely inactive way. So we've really seen the mechanics of what's happening with those numbers. But we're going to get to numbers where we're going to have too many counters. It's not going to be ideal, and it's not building towards something that we can replicate. So how can we move on from this? And yeah, what's the connection between 9 and 45? We'll come back to that one. So this time we're going to take a kind of plan view of it. We're going to think about those. We're going to bring in the idea of unitizing. So that counter, we're not necessarily going to add more counters now. We're going to think about what that counter is representing each time. So we're going to carry on, but this time we can still only see the 1 counter in the pile. So we're sharing out in that ratio of 2 for Sam, 3 for Tom, and we're keeping on sharing out. But now we're thinking about what each of those counters represents each time we add the next load of marbles. And we've talked about the shares. How many shares have we shared out? So we've shared them out 9 times. So how many marbles or counters are in this pile? There's 9 again, aren't there? Okay, so from that, we can start to build towards something more that looks a bit more like the bar models that we're quite used to. So I'm just going to leave those 2 bar models there and say what's the same and what's different about them. Now, the top one looks very much like those piles of counters. So we've got the 2 for Sam, 3 for Tom, but clearly they're in two lines. So we've got that idea of part to part comparison. In the bottom one, I've put them side by side underneath my bar representing 45 marbles. So I'm now representing those parts to the whole as well. So I've brought the whole into play here. So now I can see where that 45 comes from. Now, I'm quite sure that some of you, or some of us, when we looked at that problem on the front page and when we looked at it to begin with, went, oh, well, 3 to 2. So add those together to get the 5. 45 divided by 5 is 9. Okay, yeah. We've learned that way to do things, that's it. But where do all those other numbers come from? I've got a 2 and a 3 and a 45 in my problem. So it's thinking about where those come from. So where does the 5 come from? We can see it really clearly here. 3 plus 2 equals 5. And we've now got 5 piles of marbles, and we've got to think about 45 into 5 equal groups. And then we've got our 9. We can see where the division bit comes from. So here is that strategy that we might well have used. Okay, so this whole divide by 5 bit, we can start to see by building up those bar models where the perhaps more formal method, the procedure that some pupils will end up working towards. So there we go, 45 divided by 5 is 9, 9 times 2 is 18 for Sam, 9 times 3 is 27 for Tom, 27 subtract 18 is 9, Tom's 9 more marbles than Sam. We wouldn't be displeased if we saw that, I should think, in a book. But we've got to have a think about where this comes from in the representation. So where's the method in the bar models? Where is the divide by 5? So hopefully we can see here, certainly in this one where we're representing the parts against the whole, that we can see the 45 divided by 5 and how that 5 comes from adding the 2 and the 3 together. Because otherwise, if you're just looking at that 2:3 and say, well, add them together, why? Why do I add when there's a colon between them? What's it got to do with anything? So this use of bar models, use of representation will really, it'll mean something. There'll be and if it gets forgotten, they've got a bar model to visualize, and they go, oh right, oh yeah, that's where that comes from. I see. If we're using these bar models and we're thinking about this part to part, do we actually have to calculate the 18 and the 27? Because when we were using the counters, the 18 and the 27 were never sort of enumerated, were they? It was that difference of 9 that was there all the time. So I think that's an interesting one to think about as well. We don't always need to get there. Very quickly, I just want to show you how ratio tables are lovely. They're really good. But I want to show you how far away from the question the ratio table that solves this problem is. So we've got the numbers 45, 2 and 3. So they represent how many Sam gets and Tom get in that first kind of handing out, and the total of marbles at the end of it all, 45. I haven't really got a ratio table I can solve here yet, so I've got to fill in some numbers for myself. I've got to get to that total of 5 marbles. That first sharing out is that 5 marbles. That's great, that's lovely. So I'm there. I can now work out some other values, but actually I need to know how many more marbles Tom gets than Sam. So I need to know the difference. So I've got another column to add in to create this ratio table that I need. Okay, so the difference there at the beginning was 1. So now I've got that little ratio table, the bit I need in order to be able to use a ratio table to solve this ratio problem. So interesting to see that of the numbers I've now got in my ratio table, only the 45 was in the original problem. I've had to do a lot of thinking and understanding about what's going on in order to create that ratio table. So they are brilliant, especially if we understand about multiplicative relationships. But sometimes we've got to do quite a lot of hard work in order to get to the ratio table that we need in order to solve it. And now I can start to look for those relationships. And I'm just going to leave you, and the other way, the relationships in both directions as well. So we've talked about all of that, where the roots of the formal method are there. Improving mathematics at key stages 2 and 3, one of their recommendations is about teachers at both key stages having an understanding of the teaching methods outside their key stage, understanding how things are taught. And just finally, this was one of my last pupils I taught, my last year 6 class, and this was a year 6 solution, and I don't think she used much of what you had when you said how you solved your ratio problem. So she said, okay, so Tom gets 1/5 of the marbles more than Sam each time. So I need to find a fraction equivalent to 1/5 with 45 as the denominator. So 1/5 is 9, so he gets 9 more marbles. And that just to me indicated that pupils do have the arithmetic skills in order to solve problems involving ratio. We just need to, as Sarah's pointed out, isolate what those skills are and support the pupils to make those connections between different areas of the curriculum. And I will stop there. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Alison. Really thought-provoking stuff and really helpful to help us go into our next session now. So now I'm going to stop the recording for a moment in a minute and get us into breakout rooms. Joe, are you sorting the breakout rooms out for us? You're on mute. You're on mute, Joe.
Done.
Thank you.
I've put them into 6 rooms. I've got Brighton 1, Worthing, Eastbourne, Horsham, Mid Sussex, Brighton 2, because there's a lot of you from Brighton, and then I've put a room 6. It'd be great if it was roughly 4 in each room. So I think you should be able to come in and out, and if I need to create more rooms, I can do. So if I open that up now.
Great. So people select their room, they've been assigned to a room, Joe.
There, close. So unassigned. So do I need to do it, don't I? So if I put, I see. Sorry, I thought I was going to be very clever here.
Joe, I don't know whether if I click on the breakout rooms, I get the option to join any room.
I'll join it. Yeah, that would be great. That would be great. That's what I thought it was going to do.
Okay, so Joe, did you want to direct people to a particular room number or?
No, I won't. Just Brighton, watch out. You don't want to be 8 or 9 in a room.
In the breakout rooms, we'd like you to talk about ratio in the first instance and how you teach it in primary and secondary, to have that rich discussion, hopefully, of your pedagogy and practice and policies around that. So that's the task. We've only got about, I'd say, 10 minutes to do this task, so I think that's probably as far as we're going to get today. Would you agree, everyone else on the panel? Yeah, focus on ratio. Fabulous.
So people might like to join Brighton 1.
Excellent. So let's see what's in the chat box so far. Okay, we've got some feedback there. We're going to have a bigger discussion of methods used. We can be consistent as possible across the transition. We were talking in our group about language being absolutely key. And I know, Matt, you were saying about this issue that when, again, children have had some experience, they kind of maybe like rabbits in the headlights when they get to year 7 because the language is different, the representation is different, and they don't feel quite as confident to put themselves out on a limb in a new environment, as Alison was saying earlier on. Yeah, thank you. Louise is saying again, discussion about language. Representations are consistent, manipulatives are consistent and utilised across all year groups, which is really helpful feedback. Thank you, Harry. And we were talking as well about some of the secondary schools now have got the white rose scheme of work has been adopted. So if the primaries are using the same scheme of work, there could be again some real great good overlap in terms of the way things are being delivered. It'd be so useful to know that about your feeder schools and your secondary schools. It's so useful to have those conversations. What is your scheme of work? What is your go-to resources? And of course, lots of us are using now the Ready to Progress materials, Alison talked about, that help us prioritise the curriculum. And of course, this unit sits, doesn't it, under multiplication and division. Deb, is that right? Is that where can we find this ratio unit?
Yeah, it's addition, subtraction, multiplication, year 6, and it's criteria 3.
Thank you. Excellent, just to clarify that.
I think I also heard some colleagues in primary saying that it's really useful actually to see what we're aiming for, what the GCSE questions like. So that activity that Ruth shared at the beginning of the session was really useful for that. And I think that would be a useful thing to look at in sort of transition meetings and to discuss.
Excellent. Anyone else like to feedback from the breakout room? We'd love to hear from you. Feel free to unmute yourself to contribute.
Should I just share the Padlet
Please.
so that people can just, if they haven't seen it before, they can see it. So this is our Padlet, which we shared with you at the last session. Over here, there is a new section which just says session 2, which is today's section. There's a year 6 chapter on ratio there that you can have a look at. And the problem which Alison shared with us today is there, how would you expect a year 6 to solve this? How would you expect a year 7 to do this? So you could always use that if you're having transition meetings. And then all of the other resources are there as before. We've now got a little star system on here so you can actually rate the articles that are on here. So please feel free to do that. We would really like people to interact with this. So feel free to add any resources that you think others might find useful. This is a collaborative document, and the more people that we can get putting things on here, the more it will benefit all of us. So please do use it. And if you have used it since the last session, please just write into the chat what you've found useful. Let us know. That would be really nice. Thank you.
And that booklet that Sarah mentioned at the beginning is the year 6 booklet from the DFE and the NCTM. It's not just ratio in there, it covers all of the Ready to Progress strands from year 6. So it'll be a very useful discussion focus for, again, a team from Key Stage 2 and Key Stage 3 to get together and have a look at. I think there'll be lots of fruitful thoughts will come out of that, really helpful.
And further across on the Padlet are all the other resources, so the other transition resources, but also I think there's a link on there for the Ready to Progress for the whole of primary, so that could be useful for people as well, because sometimes when you're isolating the skill and you think, oh, how do I go really back, I've got this child that really isn't grasping this, what can I do to help them? You could look right the way back and go even back to year 1 and year 2 and build up using the resources there that are really fantastically written.
Excellent, thank you. And as I say, we're going to have some feedback in a minute. So is there a link for people to
yeah, I'll pop a link in the chat.
Thank you, Ruth. You've sorted that out for us. If you don't mind, again, taking the link from Ruth in the chat box, There's just a really quick evaluation for you to fill in what you'd like in the future. It'll be really handy. I'd like to say thank you so much to everyone who's joined us this evening. I hope you found it useful, thought-provoking, and certainly something that will hopefully, again, be a stimulus to go off and do a bit more on transition with the schools that are in your own locale. Huge thanks to Alison from MEI tonight, Alison Hopper, for your input and all your thought-provoking session. Alison will be leading a year 5 to 8 project for the Sussex Maths Hub next year. So if you're already somebody who's thinking, wow, I'd love to be involved in that, please, again, do express your interest to the Maths Hub, and then we can make sure, again, you've got sort of put on a list, as it were, to get direct mailed as soon as we have any more information about that. We start recruiting that in the summer. That's right, isn't it, Jo?
Yeah, that's right. So we've got possibility of 3 groups. So if you are interested as well in leading, do let me know.
Fantastic. So leadership roles there as well as participant roles to get involved in that, and they again really, really valuable bit of CPD for you and helping you again in your own career development and your own schools development. We've also got to say huge thanks tonight to Jo Stedman, who's our Maths Hub lead. Thank you for your facilitation, Jo, this evening. Thank you to Sarah, who's done an absolutely stonking job putting that Padlet together for us. That, I think it's going to grow and grow, and no doubt be revisited again, I'm sure, in the autumn when we do pick up these year 5 to 8 groups. That'll be a great starting point and launch pad, won't it, Alison, to move on from. Ruth has been an absolute star in all her early research for this transition group. Again, really sort of seeking out the views of teachers in the classroom all over Sussex, which has been, again, an absolute springboard for our discussions and the direction this group has gone in. So thank you so much to Ruth. And Deb Friss, absolutely, again, fantastic to have Deb's expertise as our secondary secondary co-lead rather than mastery in Sussex Maths Hub. They brings a wealth of knowledge and experience from Durrington Research School as well. So happy to have you along this evening. And so thank you to everybody, for your input. And we hope to see you again soon. Please, I think on the evaluation, put what else you would like, because we, again, are very responsive to need. And being webinars, we haven't got to book any venues or making a cup of tea. You make your own cups of tea, and we can just sort out the content and put on whatever you want whenever you need it, really. So just let us know, and we'll do our very best to meet everyone's requests. Thank you very much.